Welcome to Newcastle Library and our presentation, Railroads and the Checkerboard Landscape in the Northwest. This program was brought to me, suggested to me by our wonderful Newcastle Historical Society. Russ, would you like to say a few words about this society at all? Am I putting you on the spot? We've got Russ Segner here. We'll give him a little introduction, and then he's going to introduce Charlie, our presenter today, and we'll get underway. But I want to thank you all for coming and for your interest in this wonderful topic and the history of this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. On behalf of the Newcastle Historical Society, several of our members are here. Welcome. And we're pleased to present this program today. We're all about information, sharing of information on history and a lot of things, some of which are very obscure, and we want to bring them to light. We have a member here, Don Potter, local retired physician, who has joined us in the last couple of years, and he brought this topic to our attention, and so he's going to introduce our speaker. So Don, thank you.
I'll make a brief introduction. I'll start by showing you what we're talking about. This is the Mount Baker Snoqualmie forest map, and you can see, I'll put yours down here, you can see what the checkerboard looks like. Great. And this is what we're going to discuss tonight. I'm going to use my friend and long-time associate in the conservation community of Seattle, Minnesota, Charlie Williams.
Thanks, Don. Okay, so thanks, Vicki. Thanks, Don. So I grew up in Bellevue, and so been around here for a long time, and always was interested in why things were where they were. You know, why was that road over there? Why is that building over there? Why is this railroad here? And there was always reasons. Some of them were physical, some of them were financial, some of them, you know, all kinds of reasons. And but as I got into hiking in the Cascades, I started to see this checkerboard pattern of clear cuts. I said, what is this all about? Well, as Don knows, I've spent a good share of my adult years trying to eradicate the checkerboard. That is, pick up the privately owned sections and make them part of, in some cases, the Alpine Lake Wilderness or various other places, Mount St. Helens National Monument, things like that. So those are the kind of things I worked on. I really started in forest conservation in 1976 with the Alpine Lakes Wilderness Act, and moved on to spearhead the effort with Susan Saul to get a national monument for Mount St. Helens just 2 years after the big eruption. And then 1984 was the Washington Wilderness Act, and then there was subsequent wilderness acts and such. But they were all affected by this land ownership. And so tonight's presentation is getting me into the nitty-gritty of what was going on over the last century and a half, but also trying to pull together with these maps the patterns, which help get inside the head of the people who were making those decisions. And they were, you know, congressional, they were presidential, they were financial, engineering, and all the rest. And so when you go through this, you start to see, not that I can fully understand all they were considering, but some of the key issues. And then what was the effect on the land? And you can still see the checkerboard landscape from the air and even from the ground. So, okay, extra point for whoever can tell me what this photo is of. It is the Cascades. Don? It's actually Skykomish, which ironically is in the middle of some of the checkerboard, but was not a Northern Pacific Railway line. That was the Great Northern, which came later. Anyway, there are a huge number of stories. You cultural historians, you know that you can go down one rabbit hole and find another one. So I'm really going to try to keep myself to the slideshow and not get diverged too much. But, and this was outgrowth of my work with the Sierra Club and the Cascade Checkerboard Project, which was to try to deal with this checkerboard ownership pattern. Okay, I think most of you folks will recognize Washington State, and this is a map up 5 or 10 years ago, and you can see the various ownership colors here: state ownership, federal ownership, and but if you look closely, these are the remnants of the checkerboard country. A lot of them is state, and some of them federal. And so when you go out there, you can actually still see that ownership pattern. So, but that's a huge task. What I'm going to focus on is this section of the Cascades and Puget Sound from 1864 to 2019. Let's go back to 1864. This was the year that Congress passed the Northern Pacific Railroad Act. It was a few years after they had done the Central Pacific Act. And so they wanted to go from Lake Superior to Puget Sound. I didn't say exactly where on Puget Sound, but just Puget Sound. So what did Puget Sound look like at the time? And what you can see here is the cluster of homestead patents. But probably more important is looking at these treaty areas. So this was a few years after the treaties with the Native American tribes. They'd established the reservations and had moved most of the Native American people into those reservations. That meant that all of these other areas outside the reservation were considered public domain. They were federal lands, considered public domain, and the federal government's policy was to get rid of the public domain as fast as possible. And so you had miners, you had loggers, you had homesteaders, and you had railroads. And Congress had, never had very much money, but now they had lots of land. And so they used land as the subsidy to get development here. And so, of course, there's a huge story and a very important story prior to 1864, beyond what I can, delve into today, but I think most of you know the story of what happened to the Native American tribes and how they ended up on those reservations. So this was the United States in 1864, and as you can see, here's the Confederacy here and here. The Union had overtaken these areas, but there was still a very strong feeling of wanting to get a rail connection between the Great Lakes and Puget Sound. The Central Pacific came through here a few years earlier. That actually, I think they finished construction in 1869. They passed the Northern Pacific Grant Act in 1864. So where was it going? Well, this was the metropolis of Seattle at that time period. And so the connection was more than just some small villages there. There was trade across the Pacific, but as much as anything, being able to move military, out here, because not too far north was Great Britain and what became Canada. And they just wrestled this area away from, or split it between British Columbia and the Oregon Territory just a couple decades earlier. And so there was always a sense of wanting to be able to actually control the area. But a lot of them lived outside the metropolis in places like this. A pretty rugged time. So railroad land grants. This is not the only one. As a matter of fact, there were dozens of them. And I mentioned the Central Pacific, Union Pacific. But actually, early on, the first ones actually went from one side of Iowa to the other, or Kansas. And then they kept coming up with more and more, because these were all territories, and they had lots of public domain in the 1860s. So the Northern Pacific, however, was the largest. It eventually totaled 40 million acres. And for comparison, Washington State is roughly 40 million acres. So the thing is that most of the people probably in Washington, D.C. were thinking about railroads that you would see in the Midwest. Fairly flat, fairly straight, town here, town there, you know, wheat silo, whatever, just keep on going. Well, that works until you start to get to the Rockies and Cascades, and then the engineering challenges became huge, the costs became huge, the greed of the railroad companies became huge, and so there was, throughout the 19th century, there was incredible amount of corruption. Like, we need a new act passed by Congress in 1873 to help us because we haven't started construction yet. And like, you know, Senator, I have this envelope here just in case you wanted to have a few shares of the Northern Pacific Railroad Company. And so there was this very direct, you know, bribery to get an incredible grant. So here's the Northern Pacific Railroad route. Now, what's interesting is they didn't actually start from Lake Superior and go to Puget Sound. They actually, the first segments were from Tacoma to Kalama on the Columbia River and across the state of Minnesota. And the one along Minnesota was done hastily because Congress was getting impatient. They hadn't even constructed anything. They'd been granted all this land and everything, but they hadn't done anything. One of the things that really got Congressman upset was the hold that the railroad had on the land. Like, remember, this is all public domain, and so here was the route that they had selected. Well, actually, first they were going to go down this way, and maybe go up to Bellingham. But, you know, they could select their route. It had to be approved by the Secretary of Interior. They could select their route, and some of them were saying, you know, if we went all the way to Bellingham before we touched saltwater, look at the additional land we could have all along Puget Sound. Well, so you know, round and round and back and forth, and eventually selected Tacoma. And as you can see down here, they were going to go along the Columbia River and get all this land here. They eventually went over Stampede Pass, but so here's where the grant would be. You can see in orange, 40 miles this side of the track, 40 miles that side of the track, if you were going through a territory. 20 miles either side of the track if you're going through a state. There was 2 states that the track went through. Now, one of them should be obvious right here. Anybody want to give them a guess? Oregon. What was the other state? 1864. Minnesota. Yep. The rest of it all went through territories. Now, if Washington had been a state in 1864, that grant would have been half the size. And if you look closely, you can see that there was a variety of routes that they selected. And this came down to the engineers trying to have something as flat and straight as they could, and the financiers who wanted to connect up resources and people. And actually, the cargo was the moneymaker, not people. And so they were looking like, okay, so where do we need to connect up? And then how do we do that and keep it under a 2% grade? Or where do we have to build tunnels and trestles? So here's the way it was built in Washington State. In 1873, remember it was 1864 they got the approval. So they built between Kalama on the Columbia River and Tacoma. And so if you were wanting to take the Transcontinental Railroad, you get on at Tacoma and you take the train down to Kalama, and then you take the ferry down to Portland, and then a couple years later there was a tracks there to, you know, farther east. That was in 1873. If you go a little bit farther, you see this little pink piece, 1877. Not going very far transcontinental, is it? What was it looking for? Who said coal? Coal. That was a major driver for the railroads, not only the local railroads, but the transcontinental railroads as well. And some of it was to provide coal to the engines, but mostly it was their cash. Hauling coal. Coal was very important throughout the economy. And so whether it was here or on the other side in Roslyn, they wanted to be close to the coal. Okay, so now we're doing here. At the same time, they've been building across the plains and across the Rockies, and they come down to Pasco and Wallula in the early 1880s. Then they built this section in Oregon on this side, and then all you had to do is take the ferry from Kalama across to Oregon, a little town called Gulpville, and get on the train there and go down to Portland and get connected up. Now, that little piece there got them their grant here, 20 miles wide either side. I don't know why they didn't go all the way down the Washington side, because they would have gotten twice as much land, but maybe engineers, had something to say about that. Now, then they finally built this segment over the Cascades, which was a tough building job. This shows you where the UP, the Union Pacific lines connected up in here. And I use Northern Pacific and Union Pacific and Great Northern in kind of the generic way, because each one of those was actually conglomerates of various companies that were formed, reformed, pulled together, owned by different people, but all under kind of this umbrella. So when you see UP, if you know your history down along the Columbia, you know there was 3 or 4 companies before it actually became the Union Pacific that we think of. And the Northern Pacific, same way, Great Northern, the same way. Okay, so here was your connection in the early 1880s through Salt Lake City. And then finally, Northern Pacific decided that they were going to give up on this side, and they built their line down to Portland, and then they built their own line on the north side of the Columbia River. And a few decades later, they started abandoning those. So that's where the lines went. But let's take a look at what it took to get over the Cascades. There's a Stampede Pass, over 4,000 feet, but take a look at this line here. That was the railroad in 1887. That's the one they completed. And if you see these circles there, those are switchbacks. Now, those of you that think of switchbacks, as you go up, you kind of take a sharp turn, you go back this way and take a sharp turn. These are actual switchbacks. So you come up here from down here in Easton, you do a curve here, and you switch back, and you back up this next segment. And then you switch forward, and you go up over the top and around here, and then you switch back again, and go up this one, and then you come back down, forward, and continue on. Those are real switchbacks. Great Northern did the same thing over Stevens Pass, which is a wonderful story. I'd love to tell you, but I'd never get out of here tonight if I got off on the Great Northern. So that was the switchbacks, and then, this shows you what it is. So here's coming up, and it's dead ends here, and then they come here, and it'll climb up this way, and then look at the trestling. So the engineers had to figure out, how can I keep this grade at somewhere under 2.5%? Because otherwise, anything over that, you got to get another engine to help out. And when you're doing this, you got only one train going at a time. They got to get up over the top and back down the other side before the next one going the other direction go there. In the wintertime, like, all bets are off. I mean, this is before our current climate issue. There was huge amounts of snow up there, and they had to clear that off. So the engineers and the financiers decided that a tunnel would be a better choice. They actually made this decision at the same time. They really wanted to connect up, and so they built this kind of temporary line over the top of the pass, and you can still see pieces of that grade. But they dug this tunnel, which not only eliminated 4 of those switchbacks and several of the curves, but it also eliminated like 900 feet of elevation gain. That's huge for a railroad. And as you know, the Milwaukee Road dug a tunnel under Snoqualmie Pass about 9 years after they went over the pass. And the Great Northern dug one and then a second tunnel to try to reduce the grades to get from one side of Stevens Pass to the other. All right, so here's 1889. Very interesting point in time. All of you know from your Washington State history, this was the year that
Became a state.
became a state. Okay. What happened when these western territories became a state? A number of things came into play, but one of them was grants for a variety of things, including schools. And we'll get into that a little bit more later, but if you see each one of these brown ones, that's section 16 and 36 of every township, which was granted to the railroad, to the school, the state, for local schools. Now, this was actually kind of a pattern that was more common in the Midwest, where you had farming communities, where a township, had a couple of schools, the next township, a couple of schools, and in many cases, other states, they sold those lands off to help build the schools. Washington State held on to most of theirs, and we'll see what happens with that later on. But the big story here is, look at all this pink pattern here. These were the lands that were granted to the Northern Pacific Railroad in the 1870s, when they had finally built their line over San Pete Pass and to Tacoma. So they couldn't get their land until they had built the track. Every 25 miles, they could apply for the land grant. And then presumably they would sell that off, and that would help finance the going along. One of the interesting things is that we're going to talk about survey here in a moment, but Northern Pacific was not anxious to get those lands into their ownership, because the minute it became their ownership, it went from being public federal land to private land, which was subject to property taxes. Now, they were certainly anxious to get land down here in the farm belts and the towns and where there was coal or a lot of easily accessible timber, but they were not anxious to get this stuff up here that was rugged and stuff like that, because they had no potential income on that, for decades. So the local counties put pressure on Congress, who put pressure on the railroad and said, you need to file for these things and take ownership. So that was one little thing going on here. Now, if you look at this, so here's the Kalama line coming up here that went to Tacoma first. That's when they decided this was going to be the terminus. Tacoma was going to be the terminus for the Northern Pacific. So this was the line that came up actually from Yakima this way. And so 40 miles out here is this gold color line here. This yellow line out there was an additional 10 miles for which they could select lands if in this area the land was not available. Well, if it was in an Indian reservation, if somebody had already claimed it, if it was mineralized, which was a huge issue, and we'll return to that later on. So while I show all of this as granted plus this is actually replacement for lands that were in here that they were not able to get. So they were going to get their 25,000 acres per mile, one way or the other. And Congress in 1873 added that 10-mile band on either side so they could get all the land that they were deserving of in the 1864 Act. Now, what you can see here, here's the southern boundary, because this was the line coming up from Kalama. This one up here. This line here was the terminus from this line, and this line here was the terminus for this line. So there, so we are just inside the grant line. This is a little closer version, so you can see here's where the line came up. That's the point where it reaches saltwater. That's the terminus, and that's what sets the lines there. Then the second line, they got a second grant to bring it over Stampede Pass. again, all this stuff's going on in DC, and they apparently still aren't making enough money. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the key things that they were looking for was coal. Here's Wilkinson, Black Diamond, Newcastle, Renton. There was lots of different places. But as you can see, one of the reasons the Stampede Pass route came this way, because they had built this section out to get to the coal at Wilkinson, and they just continued it on. Now, just a short little zoom in here. This is a map we put together of the Duwamish Valley, and here's Pioneer Square up here. This was the original route of the Duwamish. The white is the current shoreline, where you have Harbor Island and the stadiums and everything. And you see these lines of railroads that came through here. This is a little bit later, but the first one was this red line. They started building out towards Renton. It was, they wanted to go over the Cascades and connect up and be their own transcontinental railroad, because what had Northern Pacific done a couple years earlier? They put their terminus at Tacoma, which meant that it was going to be the biggest city and most prosperous city, and you could get rich there, and they just snubbed Seattle. A lot of reasons for it, but so they started building the Seattle and Walla Walla, and they went down, and they came down to the Duwamish, turned over here, and the first spot that they were going for was Renton. I know some of you guys really know the coal story here. I'm going to buzz right through it, so sorry about that. But as you know, not too long after that, they put the line up to Newcastle and did the line there. And eventually, the transcontinental lines connected up the Green River Valley and such. This little thing in here is what they did to the Cedar River in Renton, which is its own story. And like I say, if I get off on that, I'll never get out of here tonight. Okay, here, just for example, this is what Tacoma looked like, the development here, and here's where the train came in here, and this is where the second line came in here. Just so happened that, I don't know, a vice president or two in Northern Pacific had bought up some land in Tacoma before they announced the terminus of the railroad. So if we go back to the map, here's Tacoma, here's these lines, and all of this, half of it, or roughly half of it, was granted to the railroad. Okay, now, these maps have a lot of stuff going on, and this was produced by the Northern Pacific Railroad to sell land. And so if you look at this, you can see here's the Northern Pacific lands that are available if you want to come and buy it. Here's the lands that were already sold. Here's U.S. government lands that's just open, available for homesteading. And entered means that somebody's already homesteaded it. They may not have a patent yet, but they at least have entered it. And then, of course, 16 and 36 were the school lands. Now, if you look at this map, look at this area here. There's nothing in there because it had not been surveyed yet. So let's talk about the survey for a moment. So the original colonies were, property lines were kind of like wherever, this rock to that tree to that creek or whatever. The other side of the Appalachians is as the United States started to increase in size, Thomas Jefferson wanted a more organized way of determining land ownership. And so in the Ohio Valley, which was then called the Northwest Territories, is where Thomas Jefferson wanted to start the public land survey. And so, and he was an agrarian. He thought of, the yeoman farmer. Like you have towns surrounded by farms, and you have a village and a school and church and stuff. And so he said, we need to survey all of this stuff in a regular pattern, and then everybody knows where, what property they own. And of course, he'd been in France and picked up this idea of the metric system. So what he wanted was a system based on kilometers, and that he would do a townships of 10 kilometers on a side, split up into 100 sections, each one home run. Well, as it turns out, Congress was as skeptical of European ideas as they may still be. And they said, no, we're sticking with miles. Thank you very much. And so they started this from Ohio all the way to the West Coast in miles. Now, if you put a square on the Earth and you keep putting squares on the Earth, they are going to start flopping over onto each other as you get, especially as you get further north. So look at this map. It's not totally accurate, but look, this line here is a little bit off of thing. That's actually north-south. And this is actually east-west. This is longitude, this is longitude and latitude. But within that, you're going to end up with squares overlapping with that. And so with that known, you now have a system where you can find on your phone longitude and latitude of where your position is. But it used to be, I could tell you that I was in the southeast quarter of section 15 of Township 26 North, Range 5 East, Willamette Meridian, and Don would know where I was. And you can still do that. And as a matter of fact, if you own property, underlying that property, you might be in lot something of some development, but underlying that is going to be that public land survey in sections, quarter sections, and such. So when they got out to the Oregon Territory, actually it was 1851, so Oregon had already become a state, and Washington Territory, they decided that they were going to do their survey starting in Portland. And if you go in the park up, out of Portland, in the hills there is a monument there, and that is where the public land survey for Washington, Oregon started. Now, one of the reasons I suspect that they started was, if you run that Willamette baseline out there, that's kind of mountainous, but you kind of run it up the gorge there, not too difficult to survey that line. This thing comes up to Columbia, follows I-5, and again, you're not right in the middle of mountains and trying to do that. So that was the first thing they needed to do. They needed to get the baseline and the meridian, and then they would start to survey off townships that were 6 miles to the side. So I think this is up near Snoqualmie Pass. This is one of the official survey maps, and we just got to help you out. There's Lake Ketchlis, actually before they built the dam, and Snoqualmie Pass. And this is the way they number the sections. 1 through 36 in a zigzag pattern. It is really important when you get back to the railroad because the railroad got the odd numbered sections. That's how they gave them half of it, the odd numbered sections. Now, in this particular case, when this map was done, the area I grayed out there were not surveyed. They were really mountainous and everything very difficult. And so the survey folks, not that the surveyors didn't get on top of mountains and find those points, they wanted to move fast on the areas that were in demand. And that was the farmlands and the lowlands or timberlands or places like that. So they just we'll come back and do that later. So as it turns out, the lands in purple in that section, the odd numbered sections, most of them, were patented by the Northern Pacific in 1916 to 1922. Now, patent and grant are two very important terms that are not synonymous. The grant is essentially a promise like, you get this if you do something, okay? So we've granted you this land, but it's not yours. And it's not yours until you have built a section of track, 2, filed your paperwork, and you can't do that until you have a survey. So those lands had to be surveyed before they could file for them. And that's why these surveys were so critically important. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about the blue lands were relinquished in 1941. There was decades of litigation. So, but that's the pattern, and of course the state school grants, and in 1907 this was forest reserves, which the following year became national forests. All right. So here's what it looks like between the national forests between 1893 and 07. Actually, forest reserves. So there was 1893, 1898, and then Teddy Roosevelt in 1907. The first one was the Pacific Forest Reserve, which included Mount Rainier National Park, or what became National Park in 1893. Then they did the Washington Forest Reserve up in the North Cascades. Came back in 1899 and created the Mount Rainier National Park. That's going to be very important, not just because of the park, but has a significant impact on the railroad lands. So in 1907, what was the nature of the Northern Pacific Railroad grant? Okay, so you can see this is basically the same map we've been doing. Here's the forest reserves up here, pretty solid because there's no railroad grants in there. There are some state grants. Down here, this is an interesting color. So the Northern Pacific Railroad supported the Mount Rainier National Park Act because it had a provision that they were eligible for those lands, but if Congress allowed them to select other lands in the states that they had their tract in, they would give up these, acre for acre, some 300,000-400,000 acres. And some of those were in Washington State, and some of them were scattered elsewhere. So that's where the Mount Rainier National Park Act started the first land exchange of national forest and national park lands in Washington State. So the purple, these are all lands that the railroad had patented. They had filed all their stuff, and they owned that land. Now, in 1907, a lot of this land in this area, in the Snoqualmie Valley and down toward St. John's, had already been sold off to Weyerhaeuser and his syndicate. And again, Weyerhaeuser didn't actually become one big company until the 1930s. He was a conglomeration. There was the Snoqualmie Mill Company, and there was the White River, and like that. And they had various interests in these things. But the biggest timber companies were there, and then they also had Cascade Lumber and others on the east side. But they also were selling, if you remember the earlier map, of quarter sections, 160 acres, to settlers for $2.50 an acre, something like that. Okay, so that's the situation as it looked like in 1907. When I'm just highlighting here, this is what Teddy Roosevelt did in 1907. Remember, they passed an act by Congress taking the president's authority to declare forest reserves away, and that would, take place, when the bill finally passed. In the weeks before that, Gifford Pinchot cooked up the idea, and they drew up all these maps to create a significant increase in forest reserves in the United States. And so these were the lands that, one of the biggest ones in Washington State, are outlined in that in red. Now, if you look a little closer at it, look at the similarity between, these are granted lands, these are patented lands. Look at all these that are granted, and only a few places where they're actually railroad patented lands. Clearly the folks that Gifford Pinchot had working for him were mindful of that, and just grabbing, railroad land is not going to be a good idea. But if it was granted, it wasn't their land yet. And they actually had the thought that if they had reserved it, that it would become national forest and they wouldn't get it. Courts had another idea. Says the railroad grant came first, so that takes precedence. And so that's why that checkerboard lasted. All right, so here's where the national forest looked like, the next day when the forest reserves became national forests, including the ones that Teddy had just signed off on a few weeks earlier. So you ended up with Rainier National Forest, Snoqualmie National Forest, Washington National Forest, Wenatchee. Chelan went back and forth several ways, and so they've been recombined, but this is basically, these are the proclaimed boundaries for the national forest. Whatever the ownership is what the Forest Service can actually manage, but this is where the boundaries were set up. And so so that going forward, what happens to these lands? Well, as you can see, these purple, these are all of the state grants that they traded to the United States for places like the Salton Basin, the Tokskooli area up in Okanagan, Clearwater over on the Olympic. And so they blocked up lands there, and the National Forest blocked up lands in here. Some other things were going on at the same time. There were some land exchanges. See these orange lands? These were National Forest lands were traded to, I think it was St. Regis at the time, and then these other lands became National Forests, just to make it a lot easier to manage those lands. But there was another category, and that were these lands over here. During the Depression, many of the companies, lumber companies, went broke, bankrupt, and they gave up their lands. Others just decided, I'm not paying taxes on that. I've already cut all the timber. There's no value there. Nobody's buying any land. And so they just let it go. And so it went back to the county for lack of paying taxes. So the county, especially Chelan County, says, we got thousands and thousands of acres of land. We can't manage it. We got the staff. What can we do? Well, Congress said, if you want to transfer those to the Forest Service, they'll manage them. And so a lot of this area here came to the National Forest through that process. Now, it didn't happen over here on the west side because the state stepped in, and on the west side, they gave the counties the option of transferring the land to the state Department of Natural Resources. And they managed it in trust for the county, so the revenue went to the county. So two sides of the mountains, two different programs. 1941, this is a pretty important one for the Northern Pacific Railroad. You can see all the purple here, including all through here in the Snoqualmie Pass and Stampede Pass area. These light, dotted things, that shows the state lands that had gone to the National Forest. But in here, this is the important piece. So you see these kind of orange squares and these kind of pink squares. So these were still grants, 1941, still grants. There had been litigation of various sorts up to the Supreme Court and back several times for the previous 30 or 40 years. Should they have gotten these lands? No, they were mineralized. No, yes, they were mineralized. No, the government said it was okay, so therefore they went back and forth and back and forth. So finally, Congress in 1940, I remember this time period in the Transportation Act, said if the railroad will agree to a settlement by 1941, that will resolve all claims one way or the other. And so they negotiated out, and railroad did fairly well, quite frankly. But one of the things they had to do was give up their claim to these orange squares. There was over 300,000 acres, and about half of them were in the Alpine Lakes area. And if you look a little closer, you can see. So here's the orange. These were relinquished in 1941. These they did not. They ended up being patented after 1941. But take a look at a few years later. Where's the Alpine Lakes? The Alpine Lakes wilderness, the core area, were those relinquished lands. Because around the outside, you can see the patterns of where all the logging roads and all the stuff have been going, because the timber companies, which owned the, and also Burlington Northern, but Weyerhaeuser and others, they were punching up those valleys as fast as they could go. The Forest Service was, maybe trailing a little bit. They were, on the move, because the Forest Service could not say no to the railroad company punching a road across national forest land, no matter how valuable it was for recreation or wildlife, whatever. They had a right to punch that road through. So consequently, you can see all the little fingers going up the valley where the timber was. And that would have continued on if the relinquishment had not come in, and then the Alpine Lakes Wilderness, and even the Forest Service. God, they were so trying to get Deception Creek to the element. It's like have a road right through the middle of it. And the Alpine Lakes Wilderness said, that's it, nope. But anyway, the core of the Alpine Lakes was because of that relinquishment. And then this area here over in the Icicle, and these areas here where I was cross-hatching, those were not relinquished. They were eventually patented, but they were, because they'd been kind of held in abeyance for several decades, they were still unroaded when the Alpine Lakes Act was passed. And so they got the designation of intended wilderness, and in the next 10 years, they were acquired by the Forest Service and became part of the wilderness. So there we are in 1976. You can see what the pattern of ownership is. And there is still this checkerboard in here, in the I-90 corridor, and over here by Nashi and such. Now, continuing changes. So these were the big land exchanges in the 80s and early 90s. You can see the yellow here, which was acquired by the Forest Service, some of which became the Alpine Lake Wilderness, and trading away land here that Weyerhaeuser and at the time Plum Creek, or Burlington Northern wanted. Lower elevation timberlands that were adjacent to their other holdings. A little closer, if you want to take a little closer look at it, here's the Snoqualmie Pass. Here's the Middle Fork, North Fork of the Snoqualmie. And you can see these areas out here, which a lot of people didn't know much about because they were in the Green River watershed. There were no trails or whatever there, were traded out. Congress did not have enough money, and the companies were not willing to take just cash. But there was a cash exchange package that made these things happen. So this is what it looked like in 1984. You can see the pattern there. Notice the checkerboard. And I think I got helping you out. So the railroad, and at this point in time, Plum Creek Timber Company, and the companies they had sold to, went through that timber as fast as they could. And the Forest Service was, doing their part, but not nearly as fast. And so what you can see here is here's a section of old growth surrounded by 3 sections of clear cut. Like this. There was huge amounts like this. Now, they could not do that today. The State Forest Practices Act says, well, you at least have to leave some trees along the creek, and maybe a few wildlife trees or anything. So the State Forest Practices today would not allow this, but the impact, of course, had already been done. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of this, but in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a dramatic change in management of the public forests, and spotted owls and such, Northwest Forest Plan, and you can even see in this thing the checkerboard here. So how are you going to keep this Mount Rainier block connected with the Alpine Lakes and North Cascades? And so there is a number of species that are of importance to that. And so there were some land exchanges to try to block up lands. There was, this is a little bit better. So you can see trying to build this yellow area here to try to solidify, starting with the areas that were still unroaded. The ones that still had some really good forest on them. That's why it wasn't just kind of straight up a township. It was, we really worked hard to figure out what was the most important at the time and trade out of this. This package here, yeah, Cedar River Watershed. So the city of Seattle wanted to own the entire watershed, but a portion of it was Checkerboard National Forest. They had succeeded in acquiring all the land that the railroad had owned, plus other ownerships, and they wanted a national forest, and so there was legislation. They had bought lands elsewhere, a lot of it in the Colville National Forest, other places, that they traded value for value for the lands in the watershed. All right. The Cascade Conservation Partnership, we raised $16 million to buy land and give it to the Forest Service, especially along the Yakima River and other critical places as part of that corridor. And some great places that we protected. And then it started not just the clear cutting, but this kind of development, which has just as much effect on blocking wildlife movements and everything. And also it is a huge problem for fire, because now you have to protect that guy's home, maybe people in it. And so you want to do a landscape fire management plan as the winds are coming this direction, and like you've got to put all these resources in there, otherwise you're going to be on the front page of the paper the next day. And that may be just 1 or 2 houses stuck way back in some valley. It totally changes the nature of how the Forest Service fights fires once they get going. There's a whole issue about pre-fire management, which I won't get into, but once it gets going, these things are a huge problem. So making sure that we focus on even areas that have been previously cut over, acquiring those and putting them in public ownership so you don't have habitation there. And one of the things I'm proudest of is that we finally got the Department of Transportation to realize that these bridges are actually important. They would not have done that if we not acquired the lands on either side. So the effort to solidify the checkerboard country on either side of the freeway meant that the wildlife bridge worked better, and the wildlife bridge helped, the habitat. I mean, they worked together like that, and we were able to sell the legislature on funding this. As a matter of fact, I testified sitting next to the regional manager of the Department of Transportation. He was talking about wildlife, I was talking about safety. And the members of the committee, I remember a couple of them who were on their laptops like this, and there was one, she looked up and says, and you could just read her, this is different. What's going on here? Well, we ended up getting the fund. Much longer story, of course, but and that's not the last. They're actually building another one. This one is near Ketchlis Dam. It's probably been under. How many people have driven under that? All right, good. So just remember that's. Oh, and you can watch the YouTube Cascade Crossroads. That tells the story of how we did that. The next one is in the construction phase, just above Easton. There'll be another one similar. Okay, so here's the public land situation now. Much more solidified, have kind of gotten past, for the most part, the railroad era. We got lots of things. Let me just put some arrows up here. We've got national park. We have some wilderness areas. We have national forest land. We have state parks and state DNR conservation areas. We have Department of Fish and Wildlife managed areas. We have the DNR managed areas. They're all in public ownership. And of course, we have the military. We have some watersheds like the Cedar River and Told. And you can see the light green line, that's the Mount Stem Greenway, which does not own any land or manage any land. It's just a designation, which helps kind of give some identity to that area. Now, let's just take a couple of looks. If you've ever flown to Spokane, ever looked out the window, and what do you see? There's your fellow. There's your public land survey. There's your checkerboard. You can see through there. And so what I tell people is like, you've got checkerboard and polka dots. Now, every one of those townships is 640, is 36 square miles. Each one of the smaller squares is 1 square mile or 640 acres. So each one of those little circles covers some portion of 160 acres. And you can see all the way down there, the whole thing. So the pattern there, a lot of it was set up because this was railroad grant country. The line as it came down from Spokane. So half of those squares, you can count them off, the odd number ones were railroad land grants, and the intervening ones were probably one form of homestead or another. Let's take a look at it. Anybody recognize this area? So now, this is section 16. What was section 16? School grants. University? No, not school, not K through 8. It's a little complicated, but as it turns out, the state ended up with that section, and it became the University of Washington. But look how the Public Land Survey set up 45th, 15th. You know, the Public Land Survey and Checkerboard Country are on the map right now. Here's Bridle Trail State Park. Again, section 16, which was transferred from trust land to conservation, the Trust Land Transfer Program, a number of years ago. This is a Weyerhaeuser section that's been developed up near Beaver Lake. And here's one over near Carnation, and you can see the section's just been clear cut, and you know what to expect after that. Here's the Evergreen River with the sections marked out, and you can see the edge of the clear cuts very clearly along the section lines. there's the picture I showed you earlier of the entire square mile. That's that section right there. So Northern Pacific, Burlington Northern Santa Fe, BN, whatever they call themselves. So these were the driving forces for the checkerboard. Quick review, and we'll be done here. So here is the grant disposition. So of the grants in this area that Northern Pacific got, they got patent title to the purple. They traded away their grant around Mount Rainier in green. They had to relinquish their grant in the orange. Here's the lands that they got patented. What happened to those? So if you look at it, you can see, okay, this is all private. A lot of it, became a big timber company. Some of this became state. The State Department of Fish and Wildlife in the 50s and 60s bought huge amounts of Plum Creek land, or northern lands in the Kittitas Valley for elk habitat. You have national forest land here, which were, decades of land acquisition, purchases and exchanges and such. You have this land in here where the city of Seattle bought the railroad land from them. And you have these areas here over in Yakima and here where the Army ultimately got it. Now, they didn't necessarily buy it from the railroad. They may have had an intervening homesteader or whatever. But this is what happened to the grant lands. And so quickly, here's where we were 160 years ago. Grants by the 1889s, totally changing the ownership pattern. The forest reserves, which was when the federal government changed from we're going to get rid of all of our lands to we're going to hold some and manage them. But even in 1907, forest reserve, didn't say preserve, didn't have anything. It says we're going to reserve these so that you can't do homesteading and various other kinds of things. Although you did allow mining. And then we'll figure out what we're going to do. Well, as it turns out, in 1908, they made them national forests, so they're permanent. And 1941, the relinquishment. And 76, the Alpine Lakes Wilderness and the modern conservation efforts. And here's what we're looking like today. So there was lots of people involved in this thing over the last 20, 30 years. I've been working on this thing, and there are certainly far more sources than this, but I just put a few up there to show you stuff. And with that, thank you very much. If you have any questions, all right. Yes, sir. And the state said, we've got hundreds of thousands of grant lands, and they're essentially inaccessible because of the national forest. And so we can't make any money off of them, whether we sell them or manage, log them or what have you. And so they made this deal that there would be certain areas on the edges of the national forest that were national forest lands. And if you know the Salton Basin, there was a much cleaner line there. But because of the many years of making those changes, but there was also down like in the Altana, just south of White Pass. There's a block there, blocked up in the Totskuli country, out on the peninsula, where there was national forest land. And they basically got essentially all of it in exchange for the scattered parcels within the national forest. I suspect what they were looking for was timber and stuff that they could acquire, maybe near other lands that they owned, but this was in the 20s and 30s. And they had to negotiate that with the Forest Service. So I'm sure there was some sort of a compromise, and so they blocked up these areas and felt that that was going to provide them with some access and
Always curious as to why the Forest Service kept the actual river. They can't dissolve it.
Well, in the Salton Basin, by that time, the city of Everett wanted, a water supply and build a dam. Well, with all the overlapping rules and regs between Forest Service and dams and state and everything, it was easier for the Forest Service to just keep the ownership around that, what was going to be the reservoir. And then they built it and they flooded over the national forest land, which was okay. Whereas the state might have said, well, no, wait a second, you got to buy this from us. So, and then they got enough so when they raised the dam, they still had, and then they finally transferred the land to Everett. So each pattern on the map, on the ground, has a story, and it's those kinds of competing interests that set it up. But I hope you appreciate the patterns there. I mean, there's lots of detail and everything, and each piece has a story, but the patterns, I think, are really significant in terms of figuring out how things were going. How were people thinking about this back then? I mean, prior to Pioneer National Park, this is all public domain, you know. Bring on the homesteaders, the miners, or whatever. And then they said, well, part of it happened up in Maine when they had big fires, and then they had big floods. And you know, the thing that got them like thinking maybe we should hang on and own some of this land is they started filling up the harbors with sediment. So now there was another economic interest in like, wait a second, you need to manage those watersheds. Anyway, those things are all coming together. Back in 1907, you had John Muir here, and you had Everett Pinchot here, and Teddy Roosevelt. So those are the kind of things that were going on that made those momentous decisions. Yeah.
So, John, it's a very broad question, but what needs to be done now? I mean, is everything set in stone? What's the process going forward to try to?
You know, the checkerboard story continues. Like, as we speak, they're closing on like 16,000 acres of Plum Creek land, which will become national forest. The Nature Conservancy pulled that together. There's another 4,000 that the Forest Legacy Program is bringing to DNR. It won't be preserved, that's already covered anyway, but it will be managed for forest rather than development. We still have to be mindful, especially in the Central Cascades, with that wildlife connection. I am helpful, given that there's a couple of wolverines down around Mount Rainier who had to come down through all of those lands, and perhaps over our wildlife overpass. I don't know. I managed to escape the camera, but anyway. So making sure we have that forest connection. Now, the forest connection between Mount St. Helens and Olympic National Park. Now, that's a little tougher deal. Yes, sir.
I'm kind of missing the strategy behind the checkerboarding ownership, which alternates between agencies. How does that support the strategy of building a railroad or a road or things that they need contiguous land for? So it's not contiguous is what that pattern represents, right?
Right.
So what is the strategy?
Excellent question. Okay, so first off, the railroad was given eminent domain so they could build their track. They usually got 200 feet wide. The land grant was a subsidy. Okay, so basically, here you can have this, public domain land, and you sell it off for $2 or $3 an acre or whatever, and that brings in. And it does the other thing is now you have a community that needs rail traffic, and you have more farmers out there that need to ship their grain and everything. But in maybe some sense of like, okay, maybe we shouldn't give the railroad everything. Rather than giving them 20 miles of all the land on either side of the railroad, so they had total monopoly on it. I mean, think of building a freeway and giving the builder of the freeway 10 or 20 miles on either side to build whatever they want. So the idea was a checkerboard. So we'll give you every other mile, so you can amass this amount of land, but you don't get every one. And the land that you don't have is available for homesteading, and if it's close to the railroad, it's not $1.25 an acre, it's $2.50 an acre. So that was the reason for the original checkerboard. And of course, there was no thought that there would ever be any national forest there. This is 1864. There was no thought that the public land was going to be there. It was all going to look like Wisconsin, or Minnesota. And if you look at the Wisconsin, Minnesota, I mean, you see the checkerboard there from the Public Land Survey, not so much from the railroad grants. But that's why they did the checkerboard approach. And then people later were tearing their hair out. Like, now we got to deal with this.
Right.
But the originators had no thought that the even numbered sections would stay in public ownership. All right, have we run down all the rabbit holes? Okay, one more.
If you own two even numbered sections and they only touch on the corner, can you build a road from
Nope.
one to the other?
Well, we have to get permission because the road is not a line which has no width. It has a width. Now, if you were the railroad or a timber company and you had the two odd numbered sections, to get to that, they could go across that corner. The Forest Service might say we need to have the shortest route, or we need to do some mitigation or something like that, but they couldn't say no. If you're private and you don't have public eminent domain or whatever, then you got to negotiate with one or the other of those owners to get across. And they could say, sure, it's going to cost you X.
And what it really interferes with is the large development of a city like Tacoma and Seattle, because you have to homogenize all that before you can plan that out, right?
Well, what's interesting, if you notice, is Seattle was outside the checkerboard, as was Everett. Tacoma, parts of it were, but the railroad guys came in and bought the land anyway before that. And so, I mean, there's no problem with the Vice President of Northern Pacific doing a side deal to buy, 160 acres from Northern Pacific, that became downtown Tacoma.
The big cities in Washington were not going to occur anywhere else in the state. That's almost an impossibility to overcome.
Yeah, like I say, you see the patterns that have changed, and the railroads were very happy to sell land for development. Now, they had an incredible amount of leverage. So there's the story in Yakima where the railroad, there's this town of Yakima along the Yakima River near a place called Union Gap today. And it was a nice town, agricultural town. And the railroad started coming through in the 1870s. And they said, yay, oh, great, we're going to be able to ship our stuff. This has been wonderful. And they said, yeah, we're going to come right on through and we're going to put our depot 7 miles upstream. And we're going to call that North Yakima. And so the folks were, they got all their businesses and everything like that, but all of the commerce and everything's going to go, everybody's going to have to go to Norfolk to get on the train or to ship their gear and everything. So over the next couple of years, they essentially moved the town of Yakima up to North Yakima. And the site of Yakima is now Union Gap. And North Yakima is now Yakima. That was the power of the railroad. The other thing, and the railroads were the reason we have the Interstate Commerce Commission, because they would charge whatever they wanted to. And it's like you could get a ticket from, maybe from Alula to Spokane for cheaper than from Cheney to Spokane. Just kind of depended on how they wanted to do it. If you think dynamic pricing is a big deal with airlines today, that's exactly what the railroads were doing. Now, the biggest concentration of rail lines in Washington State in the first half of the 20th century, besides some of the core area around Seattle, Tacoma, Black Diamond, Columbia Basin. Because to get those products out, those agricultural products, especially wheat, which is a large bulk, you would have rail lines into each one of those towns where you had the silos. And then as trucks came along and rebuilding highways and stuff like that, they started disappearing. And so now, you have almost no rail service in that area. The peak mileage of railroads in Washington State was, I think, 1960. And then it started dropping off. And then the passenger traffic started dropping off as highways became, wow, I go over Snoqualmie Pass. Well, yeah, if you were rich enough to afford a car and stuff like that, but you could still do it. There was an uptick during World War II, and then a precipitous drop after World War II. And you know what's happened now, there's almost no passenger service. And then they start ripping up the rails. The other part of this was, which I haven't gotten into, is the railroad logging. So there was a whole network of rails that went out into the woods and brought the logs into the mills, and then from there, of course, to the lines to ship them products across. Weyerhaeuser had an interesting deal, as they bought 900,000 acres of land in Washington, Oregon, from James J. Hill in 1898, I think it was. And part of the deal and they negotiated back and forth. I mean, they lived literally a few houses away in St. Paul. If you've ever been to St. Paul, you got the James J. Hill Mansion, and then there's another house away, and then there's 3 Weyerhaeuser houses. And so they got together and said, because James J. Hill says, I got a deal for you. And so he actually took, Frederick Weyerhaeuser and his cohorts out and toured him around, and then they negotiated. And he wanted $5 million for. Anyway, they agreed on $6 million for 900,000 acres. And but the products would ship on Northern Pacific, so there was a 2-way street there. Everybody thinks like, oh my God, how cheap can you get? And we're talking the old growth like this. Remember, there was no way to get those trees out of the woods. I mean, all the stuff that had been logged down near Puget Sound or near the big rivers and everything, that's done. Now you had to build something out there. There was no logging trucks. You had to go by rail. So you had to build the rail lines and then haul them to your mill. And there was also huge fires. So it was a risk. As it turned out, it was a pretty good risk. And he came back and I think it was 1902, about another 600,000 acres. Strategic kind of stuff. And they have shifted from growing timber and manufacturing and shipping to just growing the timber. And so now they're focused down in Southwest Washington, Northwest Oregon, and millions of acres elsewhere. That's how that has shifted. And that the lands that were owned by these companies that Weyerhaeuser were one of the first to say, we're going to hold this long term. So we're going to replant. We're going to take care of this stuff because we're looking out there 30 or 40 years. Where's the timber going to come? Because everybody else was cutting and then getting out. Either let it go, sell it, whatever you could do, especially if you could subdivide it and turn it into housing. But they decided to hold on. Not all of it, of course. Some of it, but then strategies changed. Now the primary owners in the Snoqualmie Valley are TIMOs and REITs, where they buy it as an investment. They manage it for 15 years. They take their timber off it. They get their profit, and then they sell it. There's no long-term thing. There's no long-term employees. There's no real investment in the community. They don't sponsor any little league. And so an incredible change, just in a century and a half, from the treaties with the tribes to the railroad to Weyerhaeuser to TIMOs, and you can still see the checkerboard pattern from here.
It's not making it any easier to conserve. Is it not? It's not making it any harder to develop on it. How does that all play out in your mind?
The one thing about Snoqualmie Tree Farm is King County bought the development rights on the King County, most of it, in about 20 years ago. And the stuff that it didn't on the edge has now been subdivided and everything. So at least in King County, we have invested in keeping land in forest, managed in a variety of ways, but keeping in forest. So, all right, I'll take one more question, and then I think we may need to get going. Yes, sir.
So a lot of the Northern Pacific checkerboard land around here ended up being in kind of awkward spots, up steep slopes and not accessible in certain areas, especially around here, Cougar Mountain, Cedar River. And a lot of it ended up getting owned by Weyerhaeuser. But I don't really see a lot of that being practical for Weyerhaeuser to send a bunch of people out of their own employment and say, here, you're going to go log this, you're going to go build a railroad. How much of the land that Weyerhaeuser obtained do you think was logged out, not by them, but people they had contracted out? So small, because there are a lot of those small logging businesses.
Up until the late 1900s, they employed their own loggers, the truck drivers and everything. It was all the Weyerhaeuser company. And it changed in the 80s, probably about the 80s, and Weyerhaeuser decided, we could do better with contract logging. And so they gave notices to all their drivers and all their loggers and everything 1 week essentially, and in a couple of weeks, they're out, and you can come back and apply as a contractor. So that was the switch there. But in terms of worrying about how steep something was, ever been up there? See the clear cuts? No, that was not an issue. And as a matter of fact, I've got some photos from the Cedar River watershed, no less. The incredible steep slopes. They would just go up and they would drag it all the way down, put it on the rail car and ship it down there, and the place looked like a moonscape. I mean, that one was not too bad. So it only was only areas that were too difficult, too expensive to put a rail line into to capture some timber. And so when you look at the map of what got preserved, those were the more rugged areas, the areas that they, had difficulty getting into, or they were going to wait. Also, at the upper elevations, the timber was less valuable, and so that's where you see these different patterns. But no, in the mid to low elevations, the timber companies went after it, and got most of it until it became either national forest or something else. All right, I think that's probably enough for you guys for 1 minute.
Before we go, before we close, we'd like to present you with a book. I noticed you were thinking about it and wanting that, and it was already scheduled to go to you. So let me. This is the Coals of Newcastle, put out by the Newcastle Historical Society.
Right. So checkerboard country, coal, it's all pulled together. This is an incredible story around Newcastle, Black Diamond, other places. So there's some places where the railroad retained ownership. Black Diamond is one. I'm not sure how much they retained because they had coal. And, so that's the story of the railroads and the checkerboard in the Northwest. Thanks so much for coming tonight.